Would you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts this morning help us empty ourselves that you might fill us. Amen. In 2012, the New York Times kind of kicked off a frenzy in the press talking about our busyness. The article they had was called "The Busy Trap." Clearly, it struck a chord with people because there were over 800 responses to it, an all-time high for articles. Turns out we now have an actual name for this syndrome, ATBS, Addicted to Busy Syndrome. The argument that they made in that first article was all about how we continually choose to take on more and more. But when you live in a culture that prizes and values productivity over so many other things, busyness kind of becomes a default response. I think about our kids and how they have to take every AP class that the school offers, and it's not enough to play one sport. You got to play a sport every single season, and you got to have volunteer experience. Yes, we choose it, but we choose it for many different reasons, and I think if you really scratch the surface, underneath all of that busyness is this deep-seated fear that will be found out as being not enough, that will be found out that there's nothing there. Just look at the recent stats that are coming out from a Princeton study that has been doing a long-term study on mortality rates among white, middle-class, middle-aged Americans. The death toll for them has risen 0.5% every year since 1999. That is 500,000 more deaths than you would expect to see in a population that has access to health care and is relatively well off. But what's most disturbing about this study is what's killing these folks. Suicide, alcohol, drugs. They're filling themselves with these things to numb themselves, to keep at bay that fear that they're just not enough. Eric Ellis, in his book, Gifts of the Dark Wood, which our series is based on this Lent, shares a story about a friend of his named Bruce, who one night went to bed and out of the clear blue started thinking about a friend that he hadn't seen for like 2 years. They both had lived in the same city in Massachusetts, and both had left that city and had not seen each other since then. As he tossed and turned, unable to give up himself to sleep, he finally, at 1:30 in the morning, gave up, woke his wife up and said, "I'm going to go visit my friend." And she said, "That's really nice, honey. We'll talk about it in the morning." And he says, "No, I'm going to go visit him now." And she said, "He's 2 hours away. It's 1:30 in the morning. Go back to sleep." And he's like, I can't stop thinking about him." So he got in the car, he drove the 2 hours, he got to the house, he knocked on the door, nothing. Knocked on the door again, nothing. Really knocked on it, and finally lights came on in the house, and his friend opened the door and was shocked to see him standing there. And he said, "Bruce, what are you doing here?" And he said, I couldn't sleep. I just kept having these thoughts that something was wrong with you. And he said, "No, I'm fine, but come on in. Let's have a cup of coffee before you go back." So they visited for about an hour, and if Bruce had had a tail, it would have been tucked between his legs. The next morning, he didn't even want to talk about it to his wife. But about 3 months later, Bruce's friend was on his way someplace else and called Bruce to say, "Hey, I'm coming through. Can I stop by and talk to you?" And so Bruce said, yeah. And when his friend got there, he said, I need to tell you something. I need to tell you that I lied to you that day. And he's like, oh man, don't even, I'm so embarrassed. I'm so sorry. He's like, no, stop. I need to tell you, I lied to you. I was not okay. When you knocked on that door in the middle of the night, I was sitting in the dark with a loaded revolver in my lap. My life had gotten so far from God, I just figured God didn't exist. But when I opened that door and saw you standing there, I knew that no other power in the universe could have put you there at that point, at that place and time. I don't know about you, but I take immense comfort in knowing that even Jesus had days when he felt abandoned by friends, abandoned by God. I find great comfort in knowing that. Our reading this morning, you probably thought, what? What are we doing there already? Isn't this the beginning of Lent? That's the end of Lent. That's the Passion story. What are we doing there? It is inarguably probably the lowest point in Jesus' life. No doubt the most painful. And he cries out, why have you abandoned me, God? This is where the Luke passage comes in. We know the other part of the story. We know what comes 3 days later. We know what comes in the 2,000 years following that. We know the paradox that sometimes in order to gain your life, you have to be willing to lose it. That when you find yourself in those deep and dark places, the reading from Parker Palmer, have any of you read anything from Parker Palmer? Oh, incredible writer, gifted teacher. But before he became a gifted teacher, he was working his way through the church hierarchy. I think he even went to seminary, and I may even have been assigned to church. And he discovered in the midst of it all, he was empty. This was not filling him. And it plunged him into a very extended, very dark depression. And yet that reading talks about how even there, the soul, that bit of us that images God, images Christ, survives. And even in those dark places, sometimes maybe even because we find ourselves in those dark places, we can be filled with the Spirit. How exactly does that end up happening? Well, nudging in the dark, not being able to go to sleep. How many of us, if we couldn't sleep, would have gotten up, gotten in the car, and gone to that friend's house? Most of us would have gotten up, gone into the medicine cabinet, and taken a Tylenol PM. How does this happen? Did anyone happen to see Larry Patton's column in the Bee yesterday in the Insight section? Judy saw it. Larry is a UMC pastor who used to be at Wesley, and he works for Hines Hospice now. And the title of his thing just caught me. It said, "Are you there, God? It's me, Fresno, Flint, Syria." And he goes on to talk about in the article how the promise in Scripture is that God will protect us. God will protect us from harm. Well, if that's the case, then why is the death rate rising so much for middle-aged white Americans? Why are there so many refugees in the world right now? Why? This is one of those places where I think we need to gently and humbly rethink how we talk about what it means for God to protect us. God almost always does that through us. Through us. Patton, I love the way he phrased this. He says, God has created us equally vulnerable, equally dangerous. Walks away from the good and evil, okay? equally vulnerable, equally dangerous. Everyone has the capacity to hurt, maim, and murder, and we do. We always do. But everyone has the capacity to offer mercy and accept forgiveness. That's why we've got that litany of confession in our order of worship this Lent. Patton went on to say that God's protection, more often than not, comes through us. Comes through us when we stop long enough to listen to those whispers, to heed those intuitive feelings we get. Kirk Byron Jones, former pastor and now a teacher at Andover Newton Theological School, doesn't call it addicted to busyness. He calls it addicted to hurry. And he says there's a whole host of reasons why we're addicted to hurry that come out of our culture. But that one of those things on the list is that we are afraid. We are afraid that we're going to stop and we're going to feel empty. He says that when we get addicted to being in a hurry or busy, there are 7 things that get sacrificed. Patience, judgment, and not judgment as in judging others, but how we make decisions in our lives. Depth, joy, dialogue, personhood, and he says the final one, all of those others really get rolled into it, spirituality. Byron begins his days with devotion, and the first 20 to 30 minutes of that devotion is sitting quietly, empty. I've shared with every church I have ever been at the practice of centering prayer, and yet it has always been one of the least well-attended classes that I have ever done anywhere. And it might start out with quite a few people, but about the second or third class, it's done. It's down to a handful of 2 or 3 people. It's hard. It's hard to sit with that emptiness. It's hard to empty ourselves. And yet, when we do, that is where we find ourselves most filled. Each week in Lent, we're going to give you the opportunity to reflect on what you've heard. And this week, you all got a little leaf. And what I'm going to invite you to reflect on during the song. And we're taking this opportunity to introduce songs that might not be the easiest songs to sing. You don't have to sing them. The words will be up there. This is your time to just kind of reflect on what you've heard. Reflect on what might be one step that you would take this Lent. What might be one thing you would stop doing, not to punish yourself? So fasting in Lent, we all think that that's like penitence. It's not penitence, it's to make space. It's to empty ourselves. And so I'm going to invite you to take that little leaf. And this is one of the things Kent and I were going to do together on Friday, was we were going to experiment with how best to give you those leaves with a way to hang them on the branches. And when he ended up in the hospital Thursday, that kind of went by the wayside. That was my 3 o'clock in the morning moment of, oh my goodness, we never figured those leaves out. So I'm just going to invite you to write a word or 2 on it. There's pens. There should be pens in the back of the pews. If not, borrow. And as the offering plate comes around, put that in the offering plate. And I promise you that this week they'll get hung on the branches. And not only will they get hung on the branches, those of us who hang them will pray over them for you. Because it is in this paradox of emptying ourselves, of letting go of our lives, that we gain new life.